everyone. Welcome to our update on the current security environment in Hong Kong. My name is Mary Chapman. I'm Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware. I'll be moderating today's briefing. Our first speaker is Brendon OReilly. Brendon has spent most of his adult life living and working in China, India, and New Zealand. His main areas of expertise are China's foreign policy and its domestic socio-political dynamics. Brendon is going to discuss why the protests in Hong Kong have recently worsened and potential future developments. Brendon?
As I'm sure most of you are well aware, since Monday, November 11th, the protests in Hong Kong have escalated. The reason why the situation has escalated is because on Friday, November 8th, for the first time, a protester died. The protester died after sustaining a head injury. It's actually not entirely clear if the injury was a direct result of police action, and it's actually likely it probably wasn't. But regardless, the first protester death was a galvanizing trigger point that caused the protests to intensify. So from early Monday, November 11th, protesters started setting up roadblocks. It started at 7 in the morning at key intersections with the specific goal of disrupting transportation and therefore causing economic disruptions and putting more pressure on the government. A protester was shot at one of these roadblocks early Monday, November 11th. And this further caused an intensification of clashes between protesters and police. In the last several days, the clashes have been especially intense at university campuses in Hong Kong. As a general overview, obviously these protests have been ongoing now for several months, and the protesters say they will continue their actions until their remaining 4 demands are met. Obviously, the protests started because of an extradition bill, which the government has now withdrawn, but the protesters are still demanding the establishment of an independent commission to look into incidents of alleged police brutality. They're demanding universal elections in all Hong Kong elections going forward. Sorry, universal suffrage in all Hong Kong elections going forward. And they demand the release of all protesters who have been arrested. In terms of how the situation has escalated, as I said before, protesters are now specifically trying to be disruptive on weekdays. Earlier clashes and roadblocks and targeting MTR stations were primarily activities that occurred during the weekends. But now they've moved to disrupting things during the weekdays. And as I've said before, this is a purposeful effort to try to disrupt transportation and economic activity. In terms of specific disruptions and security threats, as I mentioned before, there have been increased roadblocks, especially near university campuses. There's a major north-south highway in Hong Kong near the Chinese University of Hong Kong called the Tolo Highway that protesters have maintained roadblocks at for several days now. But really, they can set up roadblocks basically anywhere. Their main point is to try to be as disruptive as possible. So this has affected central business districts. And in terms of security threats, so within just the last several days, there has been a death of a counter-protester who was injured during clashes with protesters. Essentially, we've seen in the last several days several incidents in which people who are against the protests have tried to forcibly remove some of these roadblocks. Projectiles were thrown and a counter-protester was killed. Another very high-profile incident which occurred on Monday, an individual was arguing with protesters and condemning their actions, and he was then set on fire. Something though to really stress here about threats to personal safety and security, so far serious injuries have only occurred at protest venues, or especially in situations in which bystanders have engaged with the protesters. either through clashes or through arguments. The situation has not deteriorated to the point where just random passerbys are being violently targeted by protesters or by the police. Another situation that's worth noting is on Monday, a Japanese national was beaten by protesters while he was taking photographs at a protest. What seems likely to have happened in this incident is because the individual likely could not speak Cantonese, protesters probably thought he was from mainland China, and they may have assumed that he was some sort of essentially undercover spy trying to get information on the protests. Again, though, I need to emphasize that so far, up to this point, serious injuries, or I suppose in at least one incident, deaths have only occurred at protest venues or when people are engaging with protesters. That being said, of course, there are wider transport and business disruptions arising from the roadblocks and also arising from protesters who specifically target MTR stations, rail lines, and other transport facilities. In the last several days, organizations have been reacting to these increased disruptions in a variety of ways. For the most part, large organizations with operations in Hong Kong have been increasing their monitoring of the situation and just general security protocols. We have seen a handful of organizations that have suspended some non-essential travel. In terms of government warnings, the only increased threat level that I've seen so far, specifically related to the recent escalation over the past week, was from the South Korean Ministry of Foreign Affairs, which raised their alert level for Hong Kong from 2 to 3, and this is out of a 5-point scale. So basically right in the middle of their 5-point scale. Of course, we also have seen evacuations. This is a new development. We've seen evacuations, but so far as I've seen, we've only seen evacuations specifically of university students. And likely one of the driving factors behind these evacuations, foreign national university students, I should stress. So since protests in the last several days have been concentrated and particularly disruptive at and near college campuses, many colleges and universities in Hong Kong have ended their term early. So many foreign national students, essentially their term is over. There's no classes that are ongoing. So, and as I mentioned, the protests have been particularly intense on university campuses. So there have been some evacuations specifically of those individuals. In terms of broader evacuations of all staff, that is not something I have specifically seen recently.
Thank you, Brendon. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Rocca. Tony is a senior security advisor with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response team. Prior to joining Global Assistance and Response, he was a senior intelligence analyst focused on political violence and armed conflict. Tony is going to discuss the current security recommendations for organizations operating in Hong Kong. Tony?
Thanks, Mary and Brendon. Good morning, good afternoon all. I'll be brief. I'm going to get this out of the way now. As Brendon mentioned, evacuations are occurring, but we need to make sure we are framing this in the proper context. As we have discussed, university campuses have been one of the major focal points of the recent days' unrest. So as a result, those universities have canceled classes, and most, if not all, have switched to an online format for the last few weeks of the semester. So again, as a result, foreign students in Hong Kong are simply returning home earlier. That being said, the potential for a significant escalation in the region does still exist. So if you haven't suspended travel or your organization is still operating in Hong Kong, consider implementing a work from home or a work from hotel policy. The implied task here, as always, being to ensure your people are adequately equipped with multiple forms of communication, remote access capability, and backup power supplies. If you're planning to shelter in place for a prolonged period, ensure that you're keeping your phones, tablets, laptops, and any other communications devices fully charged at all times, and make sure you stock up on food, water, and all the other essentials. Excuse me. If you haven't already done so, get accountability of all your people in Hong Kong now. Get contact information, get addresses, and start planning primary and alternate and contingency transport link-up points in assembly areas, and develop a robust and redundant communications plan. As always, local cell networks and internet providers and radio platforms spanning multiple frequency bands should serve as your primary and alternate methods of communication, but have an emergency communications plan in place as well in the event electronic forms of communication are ineffective or disabled. Have designated communication windows for safety check-ins and clear escalation procedures for when those communications windows are missed, to include mechanisms for conducting face-to-face wellness checks, and thresholds for activating emergency notification contact procedures. Organizations should also consider using WorldAware's mass notification tools to relay any pertinent information to your people in the area. Also, have your people in the city pack a go bag now. Go bags need to have all key identification, important contact information, and travel documents, credit cards and cash, ideally enough to sustain you for at least a 96-hour travel period, any required medication with your physician's prescription, extra communications devices, power supplies, high energy snacks, bottled water, a flashlight with extra batteries, a small hygiene kit, a first aid kit, and some rain gear. Once a go bag is packed, leave it packed and make sure your people are keeping all backup communication devices and power supplies fully charged. We're gonna do something a little bit different during this go around. To hammer this point home a bit, I want to play a quick game, a little mental exercise. Think about where you are right now at this very moment. For the purpose of this scenario, what you have within arm's reach are the only resources available to you right now. All right, I'll give everyone a few seconds to wrap their minds around that. Now, in this scenario, if you needed to expedite your timeline to travel abroad for whatever reason, do you have the capability and the resources to book a flight right now? Or can you contact someone who can do it on your behalf right now? Can you coordinate and pay for ground transportation to the airport? Can you walk a few kilometers to link up with your transportation if necessary? Do you have all the necessary identification, passports, and travel documents on hand to get into the airport and board that international flight right now? Do you have all essentials to sustain yourself for the next 72 to 96 hours within arm's reach right now? I encourage clients to run through that little exercise regularly, regardless of where they are. I'm not trying to scare anyone or come across as alarmist in any way. I'm just trying to illustrate the importance of packing a go bag and keeping it close by at all times. So, moving on. If you must locate in the city or if you have plans to head to the airport, try to move in groups of at least 4 people. Have multiple routes mapped out and memorized ahead of time, ideally circumventing the known hotspots in the city in case you hit some kind of choke point. Track your location at all times and stay in constant contact with your security team as you're moving. If you have the WorldQ mobile app or Critical Track on your phones, consider using the check-in functions as you're moving so response coordinators can track your progress en route. That'll make things go a bit smoother in case response assets need to be spun up on your behalf in an emergency. Also note, we have had some issues in the past when trying to facilitate client movements out of these types of dynamic environments where the clients see a number they don't recognize and are reluctant to answer their phones. And as I'm sure most of you can imagine, that makes coordination nearly impossible. So if we are coordinating and facilitating transport on your behalf, please answer your phones. Also, if WorldAware does end up coordinating transport for your people, be cognizant of the fact that protesters have blocked major roads in and around the city, so vehicle access in some areas may be limited. If you're coordinating transportation to the airport, for instance, or if that's something we are facilitating on your behalf, please know that you may have to walk a few kilometers to an assembly area before linking up with a driver or a CPO. If you have to walk to a link-up point or an assembly area, make sure you're wearing broken-in, comfortable, sturdy, closed-toed shoes before heading out. Also, the go bag mentioned earlier is obviously essential, but consider streamlining the rest of your packing list as much as possible. If you've never carried 100 pounds of kit over a long distance before, now's not the occasion to try that for the first time. A bit about transportation. Ground transport is a little spotty at the moment, as Brendon mentioned earlier, particularly outside the university campuses. Hong Kong's mass transit railway service is also suspended or amended service on several lines, so keep that in mind if you're formulating some kind of transportation or evacuation plan. Commercial air out of Hong Kong International is still available. Flights have not been severely impacted by the recent day's escalation. However, additional security screenings are in place at the airport. So if your people are planning to fly out of Hong Kong International, make sure they have a confirmed ticket before heading to the airport. They'll need a confirmed itinerary that has their full name and passport information exactly as it's printed on their passport to get into the terminal. I also want to address real quickly, and I'll wrap up with this, digital privacy issues in Hong Kong and the importance of sanitizing our electronic media devices. Make sure your people are not photographing or recording the protests or the police anywhere in Hong Kong. Inform your people to scrub their phones, tablets, laptops, and any other electronic media devices for any protest-related content before going to the airport. Delete any photos of the protest sites, law enforcement barricades, or any texts, threads, timelines mentioning, retweeting, or simply liking something related to the protest. Delete it now. Remember that all media devices are subject to inspection, and authorities can compel your people to hand over passwords to social media accounts to see if there's any connection between them and the demonstrators. Also, if your people are using those mass transit octopus cards, I think they're called, keep in mind that those keep a record of your travel history. So consider getting a new card before heading off to the airport in case you happen to be transiting through a specific area during a major bout of unrest. I don't mistake my meaning here. These type of deep dive inspections are not a universal process, but if you or your people ping the radar of local authorities in any way, that could invite closer scrutiny. So as always and everywhere, maintain a low profile and cooperate with local authorities, and hopefully things will go smoothly. With that, I'm going to wrap up. Thank you for your time. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Tony and Brendon, and thank you everyone for listening to our briefing today. If you have any additional questions, you can visit us at www.worldaware.com.